Hi, thanks for watching. I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to talk about Tai Chi and knee pain, or avoiding it, and also talk briefly about the understanding of being double weighted. So I mainly wanted to talk about this because I've run into people over the years where they said, oh yes, I used to do Tai Chi, but I had to stop because it was bothering my knees. This is both people who've done Yang style or Chen style Tai Chi. And it's an issue for every style, and I wanted to give you a little bit of context, and so hopefully that will help give you an understanding and techniques to avoid, not only avoid knee problems, but also improve your practice as well. So if we look at all the different styles of Tai Chi, they all come back to Chen style. Chen style Tai Chi was the first style out of which the other branches came from. One of the things that's important with the training for Chen style Tai Chi is what they call the figure of 8 motion through the hips. So it's something where you shift the weight, turn into the hip, shift the weight, turn into the hip. It's a very specific kind of thing which requires separating out those two actions. The weight is on both legs, you shift the weight to one, nothing else changes. And then once it's shifted, then relax and turn into the hip. Then shift the weight to the other side and turn into the hip. So there's a difference when you're doing this figure of 8 motion where you separate out those movements and what happens with the knees. If it's a moderate stance or a deepish stance, and then from here you do this motion, the main thing that's happening with the knees, it may be hard to see from that angle on the video, but the knees are basically just moving forward and back when you do the weight shift. When you do the turn into the hip, neither knee is moving much. Shift the weight so one knee moves back, the other knee moves forward. Then the knees stay where they are as the body turns. The turning action happens in the hip. So there's a big difference between that kind of figure of 8 motion and this kind of figure of 8 motion. If I put my hands here, you can see the degree to which the knees have that twisting and lateral motion, and a more proper separation of those two movements that come from here. So this figure of 8 motion is important mainly because it drives the whole routine. For Chen style routine, if we're here and we do the next two moves, there's that turn into the left hip, shift the weight, turn into the right hip, shift the weight, turn into the left hip, shift the weight, turn into the right hip, shift the weight, turn into the left hip. Continuing on, shift the weight, turn into the right hip, shift, turn into the left hip, shift, turn into the right hip, so on and so forth. So in other words, you want to be able to drive the entire routine using this particular motion. But to prevent knee injury, you need to separate out the weight shift and the turn of the hip. Another aspect of that is when you're doing the separation of those two components, the pushing and pulling, the application of the force happens when you're turning the body, not when you're shifting the weight. And this is important to understand because if you're here pushing out, and then at the same time as you push out, you shift the weight, there's going to be a point in time in that weight transfer you become equal on both legs. Weight on both legs, apply a force, apply a pull, and you will lose your balance. You will get pushed out. So the double weighted aspect of things relates back to this concept, so that when you're coming through here and you're going to do that pull, the pull needs to happen here. When you're going to come through and do that push, the push happens here with the turn of the hip. This is easier to see with Chen style Tai Chi because Chen style has a particular frame that moves from here, and the horse stance is still fairly laid out into a fairly open horse stance. Or sorry, bow stance, from horse stance to bow stance. Yang style, of course, has a much more traditional kind of bow stance, more turned, more the standard 45 degree on the back foot, and then the front foot, the toes pointing straight forward. But though it's harder to see, the same figure of 8 motion, the same shift the weight and turn into the hip is still present. If we look at this posture here, shift the weight, turn into the hips, shift the weight, turn into the back hip, shift the weight, turn into the front hip, shift the weight, turn into the back hip, shift the weight, turn into the front hip. Paying attention to the separation of those things not only prevents you having the knees getting turned, torqued, and twisted, therefore injured or painful, but it also gives you a better understanding of when and where you're applying the force and how to avoid being double weighted. Coming through, it's easy to be shifting the weight as you come through, but the weight should have already got to the 70% to the one leg, then turn. Shift the weight, adjust the hands. The shift of the weight is to gain a position that gives you the advantage. The turn of the hip, turn into the hip, is to apply the force, either the pull or the push. There's the pull. Shift the weight to get into the right position, and then from there, push. Shift the weight. Shift the weight. Push. So, I hope that information is helpful. I hope it prevents you from injury to your knees. I hope it clarifies and gives you a better understanding of the routine that you're practicing. I hope you keep learning, keep practicing, and we'll see you again.